Dr. Abraham Terian, who grew up in Jerusalem and whose earlier graduate education was in archaeology and history of antiquity, is Professor Emeritus of Armenian Theology and Patristics at St. Nersess Armenian Seminary, New Rochelle, New York. Prior to teaching at St. Nersess, he was Professor of Intertestamental and Early Christian Literatures at Andrews University for 20 years, and for 4 years a recurring visiting professor for Armenian and Hellenistic Studies at the University of Chicago. He's an internationally renowned expert in the fields of Hellenistic, Early Christian, and Armenian theological literature, fields in which he has published extensively. In 2005, he became the first recipient of the Fulbright Distinguished Chair in Humanities award by the Fulbright Foundation, the Council for International Exchange of 2008 of Scholars, CIES of the U.S. Department of State, and the U.S. Israel Educational Foundation. In 2008, he was elected a Fellow of the National Academy of Sciences of the Republic of Armenia. He now lives in Fresno, California, with his wife, Sarah, who is also a doctor in theology, and she's present. With no further ado, Dr. Terian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mrs. Mangasarian-Goshen. So glad to be here to see my fellow visionaries from Fresno. And too many surprises even after I arrived here to see my dear classmate from Jerusalem, Mr. Berch Tashjan, his brother, Dr. Sebu Tashjan, who is, I'm sure, known to most of you as a former minister of the Republic of Armenia. And so many familiar faces that I'm reluctant to single out people by name lest I forget somebody, but it is always wonderful to be among friends and see so many familiar faces and acquaintances, and more so, friends. In fact, I feel inspired today because right here in front row, I see an old friend from New Rochelle, New York, who, as a rule, for the 12 years that I was at St. Nersess, at every lecture I gave, Mrs. Anahit Yesayam and her late husband were always front row audience at every lecture. So good to see her here with her son, Dr. David Yesayam, and his wife, Dr. Yesayam as well. Well, in a place like this, we appreciate the work of people like Mrs. Mangasarian-Goshen, her helpers, and so many others, without whom such activities cannot happen. Now, this is a wonderful museum, and I'm always reminded that most every great institution that we have, ever so often, it had humble beginnings. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with humble beginnings. Let's hope and pray that someday there will be a far greater museum by this name with a seating hall 10 times as large, where Armenians will come to hear something other than the genocide. In a way, we all are victims of the Armenian genocide in that because of our absorption, consumption with it, we have, in effect, today become, and still are, victims of the Armenian genocide because of our preoccupation with it. We are becoming ignorant of our own history. We're becoming ignorant of our real Armenian culture. Now we know that Armenians are enthusiasts about their native culture. In fact, I don't know any Armenian who wouldn't jump up and down every time we say Հայկական մշակույթ. But what we forget is the fact that our culture is predominantly religious. Be it our architecture, our music, our fine arts, you name it, our literature in particular, our history. More than 90% of it is religious. And once we pay little or no attention to the religious aspect of our culture, we have, in effect, forgotten it. As a teacher of Armenian theology at our one and only seminary in the Western world at St. Nersess in New York, I've often been asked, what do I see from my vantage point as a danger even for the Armenian Church, which, by the way, has been the keeper, the custodian of our religious culture. My usual answer to a question like that is that the worst thing that could happen in the Armenian Church is for our hierarchs, or even our clergy in general, to forget what we already have in our tradition. I know clergy who don't know what we have in our religious tradition. I even dare say 9 out of 10 don't know. And the 1 in 10 who knows redeems the 9 who don't know. So, in effect, there is a degree of ignorance, even in the best of Armenian cultural centers, as to our true Armenian culture. And so when we speak about Jerusalem, we're invariably into the religious things, because that's how it all started. I have plenty to share with you within an hour, and in fact, what I have to share with you would be a survey of the history of the Armenian community in Jerusalem. I could spend a whole day talking about most any aspect of the various things I'll be touching about. But what I would like to do during this hour is just to take you through history, a walk through history. I'm not going to show pictures. In fact, I hardly meet someone in an Armenian audience who hasn't seen pictures of Jerusalem, or Armenian Jerusalem, or one who hasn't been there as a pilgrim. So I'm not going to show pictures. There's no slides, no PowerPoint, but you can visualize the things I'll be sharing with you. If there's anything I'll show you during my 1-hour talk, would be certain books, none of which is for sale. I'm not selling anything. But just to make you aware of what we have. You may take notes. And hopefully at the end we will have a question-answer period, during which time, should there be anything I missed to bring up, especially concerns of today, present-day situation of the Armenian community in Jerusalem, which, by the way, I find it to be the hardest part of my talk. It's much easier to talk about ancient things or past history. For people who write present-day history or contemporary history, admittedly, that would be the hardest kind of history to write. Just a couple of years ago, as a member of the Armenian Academy of Sciences, I was assigned to write a 50-page history of the Armenian community of Jerusalem. And I agreed to do that. This was to be one of the first chapters in a 4-volume series on the history of the Armenian diaspora. Well, I wrote my 50 pages without telling anything about the last 20, 30, or 40, or 50 years. And realizing that I have not as yet fulfilled what I was asked to do, I never submitted it, and they are still waiting for it. Well, hopefully this April I'll be there, and I'll tell them how hard I find it to write the contemporary history of the Armenian community in Jerusalem. But for us to really understand the present situation and to appreciate what we have at present and the challenges facing the Armenian Patriarchate in Jerusalem, it's impossible to do this without going back to the beginnings. The fact is, the Armenian community in Jerusalem is the earliest of the Armenian diaspora communities. Now, for us Armenians here today, who are part of the Armenian diaspora and who are concerned about our Armenianness or the preservation of our identity here in the diaspora, I think it will be a wonderful textbook experience to look at the history of the Armenian community of Jerusalem, because, as I said, after all, it is the earliest of the Armenian diaspora communities. And it survives to this day. Of course, I didn't say thrives to this day, it survives. There were times where it was thriving, and indeed thriving very well. And so when we compare those periods in history, where we had a wonderful, thriving community, with what we have today, indeed, we are overwhelmed by the challenges. By some estimates, there are those who fear, and I have had conversations with quite a few well-concerned, well-informed Armenians who are terribly concerned about the preservation of the Armenian community of Jerusalem. In fact, on every visit I make to Jerusalem, I tell the present-day Patriarch, and let us remember him in our prayers as he's still recovering from serious illness in his old age. But I've told him this on every visit, that for him to maintain a historic patriarchate such as we have in Jerusalem, it is impossible to do so without having a viable Armenian community. Without a viable Armenian community, it would be well nigh impossible to preserve what we have. In the news, you may hear about skirmishes we have with other Christian bodies, even Christian minorities, who in the 50s and the 60s were far smaller communities than the Armenian community, who today are indeed challenging us. And they do so simply because numerically, today, they far exceed us. I'm talking about the Asori, the Syriac-speaking community, the Syriac church, who actually have several few shrines and holy places thanks to the Armenian Patriarchate that over the years has granted them privileges in sites that actually belong to the Armenian Patriarchate, whether in the Holy Sepulchre Church or outside that church, or even not far from the Armenian Corinth. So the point I want to make is that we have every reason to be mindful and knowledgeable and interested in and of the Armenian community of Jerusalem. As I said, it's the earliest of our Armenian diaspora communities. Now, where and how did it begin? Most people who venture to write the history of Armenian presence in Jerusalem would begin with the conquest of Tikran the Great. I think there's no need to go that far. You know, we as Armenians, perhaps because at times of our inferiority complex, being an ancient people among empires that have come and gone, as though we want to have a history of an empire of our own. And so we refer to the empire of Tikran the Great. As a historian myself, I know no serious historian who would refer to an empire that lasted only a couple of years. And not only that, it never really truly reached Palestine, much less Jerusalem, which is in the southern part of the country. But those who studied the conquests of Tigranes the Great, of course, were proud of his achievements. But when we think about the historical situations that allowed the spread of such an empire at that time, or major kingdoms that followed the empire of Alexander the Great, it was dwindling, and they were gradually being defeated by the Romans. They lost their territories in Palestine. A Jewish kingdom that arose during the time of the Maccabees was also dwindling because of infighting, which, by the way, paved the way to the Herodian kingdom. So once you study the history of what was happening in those decades, at the beginning of the 1st century before Christ, it was virtually a devastated territory because of the wars between the Romans and the Seleucids, and then the infighting between the Seleucids of Syria and the Hasmoneans of Judea. It's just an easy walk in. But be that as it may, we're glad he reached the Mediterranean, and we do find coins of Tigranes the Great as far as the Mediterranean, or in northern Syria, not so much in Palestine. So, does the history of the Armenian presence in Jerusalem begin with Tigranes the Great? Perhaps. But there is no historical veracity to that. There are those who would say, well, there were Armenians mercenaries in the Roman army when Titus invaded Jerusalem. Well, there is some historical veracity to that, fragmentary evidence in the writings of Josephus. But again, who would be proud of mercenaries who were serving in the Roman army? Another misconception we have historically is that when we speak about the Roman army, we should not think about European or Italian Romans making up the troops of the Roman army. These were all local recruits from Asia Minor, historic Armenia, Syria, Palestine, south of Palestine, Idumea, various tribes from today's Lebanon. All these would be recruits in the Roman army. In fact, the Roman commander-in-chief, who was in charge of the troops of Titus that invaded Jerusalem and destroyed the city in AD 70, was himself Jewish. So there were Jews in the Roman army. The commander-in-chief was Jewish. We know his name, Tiberius Julius Alexander. He was the nephew of a distinguished Jewish philosopher who lived in Alexandria, Egypt, by the name of Philo. So when we speak about the Roman army, that means everybody around who were willing and able to serve as recruits in the Roman legions. So, this brings me back to the question as to when does the history of the Armenian community in Jerusalem begin? Well, I have good news for you. I love to speak to audiences and bring to their attention as much as I can that would be informative. The fact is that when it comes to history, we all are students, simply because there is so much there. And we'll forever be students. In 2008, I published the earliest document bearing on the history of the Armenian people. Now, this is not to say there were no older or earlier bits and pieces of historical information that mention Armenians or Armenia. To be sure, there are quite a few. The Behistun inscriptions in Persia, Greek historians, Herodotus and others, and Roman historians, and fragmentary archaeological evidence from around Garni and so forth. So we have bits and pieces of historical information that mention Armenia and or Armenians. But for a document in its entirety about Armenia and Armenians, the earliest such full-length document that we have in our history, believe it or not, comes from Jerusalem. I published the book in 2008, Macarius of Jerusalem, Letter to the Armenians, and it's dated AD 335. Guess what? The non-Armenian media in the scholarly world, in Western scholarship, made a big deal of this book. In fact, they are rewriting history in the light of this book. You probably haven't heard about it because it's not about the genocide. And yet it is the earliest document, let me repeat, full-length document on things Armenian. In our history. All right, what's in it? In the year 335, there was to be the dedication of the Holy Sepulchre Church in Jerusalem. You know the history, how the mother of the Emperor Constantine, Saint Helena, has been there. Earlier that decade has made an attempt to find the cross of Jesus, and so she did, and then persuaded her son, the emperor himself, who was a convert to Christianity, or eventually did, some say on his deathbed, to build a church that would cover both the site of Calvary, where Jesus was crucified, and the empty tomb from where he was risen, all in one edifice. And the bishop of Jerusalem at the time was Macarius. In fact, this same Macarius was the chair of the Sacred Council of Nicaea that gave us the Nicene Creed in 325. And he was made chair at the Council of Nicaea by virtue of the fact that he is the bishop of Jerusalem, and therefore was recognized to be foremost of the bishops some 318 of them, who gathered at Nicaea and gave us our Nicene Creed. So he is the author of this letter. And he was the patriarch of the day who oversaw the construction of the Holy Sepulchre Church and officiated at its dedication. Now, this is what happened. This letter is addressed to Saint Vertanes, the elder son of Saint Gregory, our illuminator. Apparently, he must have been very old and couldn't attend this greatest ceremony in Christendom. And so there was a delegation of Armenian clergy from Armenia who were there in Jerusalem at the dedication of the greatest church in Christendom. No doubt some stayed there, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest that. And the delegation that came for the dedication of the Holy Sepulchre had an opportunity to have an audience with Macarius himself and the rest of the bishops who were in attendance. And the Armenian delegation raised two questions: how to celebrate the Eucharist and how to perform baptism. These are the two basic, foremost sacraments of the early church. In fact, in the New Testament itself, these are the only two sacraments: baptism and the Eucharist, and how to do it. Apparently, various Christian communities in the early church celebrated these two sacraments in a variety of ways. But now that there is the ecclesiastical establishment of Jerusalem, Jerusalem became the model to emulate all over Christendom. And so Macarius writes to the Armenians, telling them how to do baptism and how to celebrate the Eucharist. Not only that, what makes this more interesting is that he tells the Armenians what is wrong in the way they were doing things. And he spells out the proper or the right way to do things in both baptism and the Eucharist. So it is informative in two ways: in telling us what the Jerusalem tradition was in AD 335, and how prior to this time Armenians were doing their sacraments. And it turns out that the way Armenians were doing things was the Syriac way, Asori Nerubes. And Macarius is recommending the Jerusalem way, which was also done in Antioch. And this became the norm for the Armenian church. Okay, there's plenty more in it, but I'm just telling you what it is. So, in history books that talk about the history of Christian pilgrimage to the Holy Land, they are revising history books to account what we have here. In history books on the beginnings of the liturgy in the early church, they are revising textbooks and history books in light of what's here. And I can go on and on. All right, so much about this. Now, when we speak about Jerusalem's contribution to the liturgy of the Armenian church, it doesn't end there. We have plenty more. Around the year 400, at most between 417 and 439 or so, Armenians in Jerusalem translated the Jerusalem lectionary. Now, in case you don't know what a lectionary is, in Armenian the word is Jashots. A Jashots is a handbook that tells you what scripture to read on each day, and especially on feast days and the Sundays in between. Sounds familiar? Our church to this day uses the lectionary. Many historical traditional churches use a well-established lectionary. Guess what? This earliest lectionary that was used in Jerusalem has been lost except for this old Armenian translation. And it survives in one manuscript preserved in Jerusalem. It's manuscript number 121. I'm so glad my good friend Dr. Levon Chukasian is here. He's very deeply interested in Armenian manuscript. In fact, he is a specialist in this field, and especially manuscript illuminations. But this Jerusalem manuscript, number 121, preserves the lectionary as it was in Jerusalem around the year 400, if not earlier. Now, in the year 382 to 384, for just a couple, 2 years, there was a Spanish nun by the name of Egeria who visited the Holy Land and spent 2 years there. One nice thing she did, she kept a diary of every place she visited. For what is preserved of this diary, when we compare it with the Jerusalem Armenian lectionary, what we have is something like hand in glove. Her description of the sites and the scripture reading at that particular site is precisely what we have in the Armenian lectionary. Now, over the years, of course, the Armenian Church, as well as other traditional historic churches, have abandoned this old lectionary. But to think that it is preserved, and only in Armenian, and just one copy that survives in Jerusalem. There is plenty more that we have inherited from Jerusalem that is part of our religious heritage, especially our sharagans. You know, we Armenians are fascinated with our musical tradition, beginning with the sharagans. My good friend John Chukasian and his dear wife are interested in the history of Armenian song and singing. The sharagans, guess what? It comes from Jerusalem. In fact, the earliest sharagans that we have, they are those on the Holy Cross. And what happened in Jerusalem in the year 335, at the dedication of the Holy Sepulchre Church, the very cross which Saint Helena had discovered was set up, erected at Calvary. And during the dedication of the Holy Sepulchre Church and the site of Calvary, there were special hymns composed for that occasion. So when you go to the Armenian sharagans and get these older hymns dedicated to the Holy Cross, lo and behold, verbatim, they are the old hymns of Jerusalem. We have them also in the Georgian church, and in part, far less than we have preserved in Armenian and Georgian in the Byzantine church. Even when we celebrate the feast of the elevation of the cross in mid-September, and we go to church and we hear these wonderful sharagans. I don't know if they sing them here on the West Coast, but we sure do at St. Nersess Seminary in New Rochelle. The hymns, Chachiko Christos Yergir Bakanem, Park Surp Chachik Alleluia, all these hymns not just the words, but conceivably the old melodies come to us from Jerusalem. Now I'd like to tell you a little bit more as to what comes to us religiously, by way of religious heritage, religious culture from Jerusalem. In the last couple of decades, I've devoted a lot of time to the history of Armenian monasticism, especially its beginnings. When we study monasticism and its beginning in the Holy Land, believe it or not, the very founder of monasticism in the Holy Land was an Armenian by the name of Euthymius from Malatya. He came to the Holy Land around the year 405. He lived to be 90 years old. And according to Saint Cyril of Scythopolis, who wrote the life of Saint Saba, another monastic leader in the Holy Land, he also covered the life of Saint Euthymius. Saint Saba, the founder of the monastery of Mar Saba in the Holy Land, which today is the oldest preserved monastery in the Holy Land, in continuous use. So those who go to the Holy Land and want to visit the oldest known monastery still in use in the Holy Land is the monastery of Mar Saba. Now Mar Saba himself was a disciple of this Armenian Saint Euthymius. And Saint Cyril of Scythopolis was a disciple of Saint Saba. And so this disciple, writing about his abbot and the abbot of the abbot, ends up telling the history of Saint Euthymius and the founding of monasticism in the Holy Land. In fact, on one page, Cyril of Scythopolis, Scythopolis is in northern Israel today, in Galilee. He says on one occasion, there was a group of 400 Armenian pilgrims who, on their way to the Jordan River, stopped at the monastery of Saint Euthymius to pay a visit to their old countrymen. Now, if you travel from Jerusalem to Jericho today, halfway in between, there is the traditional Good Samaritan Inn. Just one hill behind it, eastward, are the ruins of the monastery of Saint Euthymius. I've been there several times. And to think that monasticism in the Holy Land begins at the beginning of the 5th century by an Armenian. There are big debates in Armenian scholarship as to when monasticism begins in Armenia. Guess what? Documentary evidence in Armenian historical sources, at least in half dozen instances, beginning with the canons of Shahab Ivan of the year 444, the canons of Saint Sahag Bartev, who was a collaborator with Saint Mesrop Marshals, the last chapter in the Haja Chabadum, which carries the name of Saint Gregory the Illuminator, but actually belongs to the school of the Holy Translators. In all of these, we have documentary evidence for the beginning of Armenian monasticism in Armenia. And chronologically, time-wise, it coincides with the beginning of monasticism in the Holy Land. So for those who study monasticism in Armenia and wonder, where does it come from? Is it from St. Basil of Caesarea, Or is it something St. Gregory the Illuminator brought over with him from Caesarea? Of course, monasticism in Armenia is long, long before any Saint Benedictine monasticism in the Western Church. And historically speaking, for all those who wonder where does it come from, it does come from Jerusalem. I have another interesting thing for you as to what in our wonderful heritage comes from Jerusalem. Long ago, I have translated Goriun's Life of Mashtots, and for 20 years, I've been working on a commentary on Goriun's Life of Mashtots, because every sentence there cries for a commentary, for the simple reason that Goriun was not writing history. Sure, there are plenty of historical things in what he writes, but he wasn't writing history. He was writing a praise, encomium, kova panukyun, kova sank, for Mashtots. So there are historical gaps in his telling the story of the founding of the Armenian alphabet. And it takes a lot of work to really do justice to Goriun's Life of Mashtots by way of a commentary. Every sentence cries for a commentary. Well, the good news I have to share with you is the fact that not in Armenia, but in Jerusalem, we have the oldest, earliest extant Armenian alphabets today. And in several places, far older than any Armenian inscription extant in Armenia today. Let me share with you just a few. In Nazareth, there are two inscriptions by two fellows who were traveling together, who inscribed their name as graffiti at a site in Nazareth they visited. This graffiti was found beneath a church floor that dates from around 427 AD. The church floor dates from 427. And this inscription was found beneath the floor. The floor covered it. So it has to be from before that time. It's the earliest inscription that we have since the founding of the Armenian letters by St. Nersess Armenian. The same two fellows ended up at the Sinai, at St. Catherine, as pilgrims. And the two fellows left similar graffiti on Mount Sinai. Same names, same kind of handwriting, comparable letters. Just within Jaffa Gate in Jerusalem, we have a graffiti roughly from around the latter part of the 5th century. But far more interestingly and far more beautiful, of course, are the Armenian inscriptions that we have in beautiful mosaic floors that remain from ancient Armenian monasteries. You may have heard about Jerusalem's most beautiful mosaic, an Armenian mosaic just outside Damascus Gate, north of the city, in a district called Musrara. This was discovered accidentally at the end of the 19th century. Somebody was digging foundations to build a house, and they stumbled on this mosaic. And it has beautiful Armenian inscriptions. Indeed, one of the best samples, if one were to reconstruct the Yergatakir invented by Mashtots. And it's an inscription in a couple of lines. It's a dedicatory inscription for the deceased. And the inscription says, in memory of those whose names are known only to God. And it has beautiful tapestry-like mosaic with medallions that have different kinds of birds in each of the medallions. Something incomparable to Persian carpets. And in every guidebook to the Holy Land, it is singled out as the most beautiful inscription, mosaic in Jerusalem. Indeed, one could add in the Holy Land. One guidebook does say in the Holy Land. Some 25 years ago, they were expanding a road north of Jerusalem. And while the bulldozers were doing the work, they discovered yet another Armenian mosaic inscription. And it has a beautiful medallion, about 1 meter across in diameter. And it names the person who sponsored the construction of this place. His name is Hustatios, and it is in memory of him, his parents, and brother. And archaeologically speaking, the ruins around this newly found mosaic, and I have pictures in this envelope. I may display them on a table at the end. You may want to look at it. Must have been an extension of the mosaic that was found at the end of the 19th century, north of the Damascus Gate. But what is so interesting is that when you connect the two sites together as one continuous site, you have an Armenian monastery of such proportion that one has to wonder about the size of this Armenian monastery. In fact, St. James Monastery in Jerusalem today is the largest monastic establishment in size in the old city today. Now, what is so interesting is that in the middle of the 5th century, we had another Armenian pilgrim. And by the way, I can name you a couple more Armenian pilgrims in between, whom we know by name, and inscriptions they left. But in the middle of the 6th century, there was a certain Anastas Vartabet, who made a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. And he wrote back to the governor, Vahan Mamigonian, a report about what he saw in Jerusalem. And Anastas Vartabet, possibly one who became a Catholicos later, by the name of Anastas Akoratsi, he says he visited some 70 Armenian monasteries in and around Jerusalem. 70. Now, of course, historians who read this say there must be some other explanation, or there could be an error in this number. But archaeologically speaking, he must be very correct. In fact, if one goes to the text, one could just as well translate not necessarily purely Armenian monasteries, but monasteries with Armenian presence. And this piece of information is preserved in the history of Movses Gahankatvatsi of Arzakh, Badmutyun Alvanitz Ashkhari, in which he quotes this piece of information from Anastas Vartabet. And what he quotes is only partial quotation, because in the history of the Arvank, Movses Gahankatvatsi, which is a place in Qarabakh, he quotes only those monasteries by name that have people from the Avvank, from Arzakh. And he passes in silence over the others. So even the quotation is so precise because he names the site and the kind of Armenians at that place. And some 10 sites are mentioned by name, and the rest are unnamed. And the sites that are named represent communities from Qarabakh, from Arzakh. And he was interested only in that piece, which mentions people from his country. What precedes this quotation from Anastas Vartavet is another quotation by a guy named Hovsep the Hermit, who also happens to be from Arzakh. And he describes the church of the Nativity in Bethlehem and the pilgrimage to the Jordan River on the Feast of Nativity Theophany. And again, he quotes from this guy simply because he happens to be a compatriot from Arzakh. So, when we think about all of these inscriptions that we have, with the monastic establishments that go with them, we have in Jerusalem the precursors of the Armenian monasteries in Armenia today. Armenians who started monasticism in the Holy Land and were familiar with its structure and its canons emulated those things in Armenia. And historically speaking, we can verify this in Armenian historical sources from the 5th century. Well, let's come to the 7th century. In fact, in the back of this book, there's another letter written from Jerusalem to Armenia in the middle of the 6th century. I did not talk about it, but for those who are interested, you may find this book on Amazon.com and read it. There is no shortage of precursors of Armenian culture that eventually surfaced in Armenia. The earliest extant examples of which we find in the Holy Land, and not in Armenia itself. That's how precious is what the Armenian community preserved in Jerusalem. In the 7th century, we have the earliest mention of an Armenian patriarch of Jerusalem. His name happens to be Abraham. And he was a great diplomat. When the Arab or Muslim invasion of Palestine was taking place, this patriarch Abraham had an audience with the commander of the Muslim armies, namely Omar ibn al-Khattab, and he was not content with that. We have evidence of the fact that this patriarch Abraham went as far as Arabia and had an audience with the Prophet Muhammad himself to secure the protection of the Armenian community of Jerusalem. And in the Armenian Patriarchate today, we have documents from the 7th century that by closer examination have been verified to be exactly from this period, in which Omar and Muhammad together guarantee the security of the Armenian community in Jerusalem. I can give you names of Armenian scholars who lived in Jerusalem in the 9th and the 10th century who produced extensive writings, but I'll skip over this. Some 10, 15 years ago, I published an article in the Journal of the Society of Armenian Studies under the title of Armenian writers in medieval Jerusalem. There's a whole catalog of these Armenian writers who lived and thrived in Jerusalem and produced their writings over there. Let me now take you very briefly to the Crusaders period. You know that when the Crusaders arrived in Jerusalem, the leaders of the Crusaders, the two brothers that led out, Godfrey de Bouillon and Baldwin, Belgian French brothers who led the European troops of the First Crusade. And by the way, this was the only crusade that was successful in its mission in capturing the Holy Land. They arrived there in 1099, right at the end of the 11th century. And on their way to the Holy Land, these two brothers married Armenian princesses, the daughters of Toros, the Armenian prince of Edessa. And so when the Crusaders got to Jerusalem and they conquered the temple area, they set up the first Latin kingdom of Jerusalem. And Baldwin became Baldwin the First, king of Jerusalem. And his wife, an Armenian, was the queen, Queen Arda. The successor of Baldwin I, Baldwin II, decided he too should marry an Armenian princess. And he married the daughter of the governor of Melitene by the name of Melisende. Pardon me, her name was Morphia. Melisende was her daughter, and she became the third Armenian queen of Jerusalem because she had no brother or heir to the throne. And she married the Prince of Anjou via Cyprus. But anyway, be that as it may, you have three Armenian queens for the duration of the Latin kingdom of Jerusalem, which of course, as you know, ended up when the Crusaders were defeated eventually in 1187. Now, what is so interesting is that these Armenian queens of Jerusalem became great benefactors, not only to the Latin Church, thanks to their husbands, but also to the Armenian community. Today, if you visit Jerusalem and go to Gethsemane, to the traditional tomb of the Virgin Mary, as you walk down these steep steps down to the tomb of the Blessed Virgin, halfway down the stairway on both sides, there are altars. This is where these Armenian Crusader queens are buried. In fact, the best preserved Crusader church in the old city of Jerusalem is the Church of St. Anne, and it was sponsored by Queen Melisende. Today it doesn't belong to Armenians, it belongs to the French Père Blanc order, but it's a very nice place to visit. And to think that this was built by Armenian benefaction. One interesting thing is that when Saladin invaded Jerusalem, the Latin Patriarch and the Greek Patriarch left the city. The Armenian Patriarch decided to stay.
Good for you.
And when Saladin conquered Jerusalem, just out of his admiration, granted the Armenians protection, not just for his time, but for successive generations. And an inscription by Saladin actually adorns the very entrance to the Armenian monastery of St. James. When you visit today and walk through that big, heavy, black iron gate, the first monument you see in front of you is an inscription from the time of Saladin, granting amnesty to the Armenians. All right, I can go on, and what happened later on, even as the Ottomans came. What is really interesting is that there were judicious patriarchs in the history of Armenian Jerusalem. There were great diplomats who indeed saved the situation for their time, be it in the 7th century when the Arabs conquered the Holy Land, or late in the 12th century when Saladin defeated the Crusaders. And you can project that for today as to what is really needed in Jerusalem. But let me just quickly take you through the Ottoman period. Through the Ottoman period, the old rivalries between these old traditional patriarchates, the Greek, the Armenian, the Latin patriarchate, these came to fever pitch, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries. And one sultan after another was bribed at one time or another to decide issues relating to holy places in the Holy Land in favor of the Greeks. And so the Armenian community suffered, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries, to the point that patriarchs began to mortgage Armenian properties. Greeks were emboldened to possess Armenian sites. In fact, we don't talk much about it in history books, but for a couple of years, between 1762 and 1764, the Greek Patriarchate of Jerusalem had full possession of St. James Cathedral. Oh. Mind you, this was the headquarters of the Apostolic Church before St. Peter ended up in Rome. So when you think about historically on the primacy of apostolicity, the Armenian Patriarchate in Jerusalem, by virtue of the fact it's been established on the site of the residence of St. James, where the first apostolic council took place. This was the headquarters of the earliest church that we know of in the book of Acts. Historically speaking, one can make better arguments for the Patriarchate, the Armenian Patriarchate of Jerusalem, than the Catholic Church can make for the See of St. Peter in Rome. That's how precious the Armenian Patriarchate of Jerusalem is. That's why the other patriarchs, the Latin Patriarch, the Greek Patriarch, are envious of the Armenian Patriarch because, historically speaking, he has the primary site of the See of St. James. Now, I wouldn't tell you about stories about possession and repossession in dark times, but we had great patriarchs who rose up to the challenges of their time. In the 17th century, the middle of the 17th century, Krikor Baronder took it upon himself to redeem all the sites that were mortgaged by his predecessors and beyond, enough to have so much so that he could add to the possessions of the Patriarchate. The same happened again a century later, when Krikor Shıhtayagir, a great patriarch from Istanbul, came over to Jerusalem as patriarch and took upon himself to liquidate the debt of the Patriarchate and beyond, to add to the possessions of the Patriarchate. Even outside the city of Jerusalem, even in other parts of Palestine. But when you think about what we Armenians have within the old city of Jerusalem, the site of the Armenian Patriarchate within the old city is about 1/5 of the whole old city of Jerusalem. It's as big as the whole temple area, stretching all the way from Jaffa Gate to Zion Gate. That's the possession of the Armenian Patriarchate in Jerusalem, in addition to equal rights and privileges and ownership in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the greatest church in all Christendom, in Bethlehem and in various other sites. That's how significant is the Patriarchate of Jerusalem. Now, great things happened there. There was a scriptorium. There were writers in Jerusalem. There were great spiritual leaders. I can give you scores of names of poets who lived in Jerusalem and wrote prayers and poems on the respective sacred sites throughout the Holy Land. We don't have these in English for Armenian pilgrims today to read what Armenian predecessors visiting and living in the Holy Land came up with. Now we all love the last and greatest of Armenian theologians, Saint Gregory of Datev. We visit his monastery in Armenia, Datevabank. Do you know that Saint Gregory of Datev was ordained priest at St. James Cathedral in Jerusalem? He came with Hovannes Vorodnetsy, his bishop, as a pilgrim all the way from Armenia, as fellow travelers. And Hovannes Vorodnetsy was so fond of his disciple that when they arrived in Jerusalem, he ordained him priest at the very altar of St. James. I can tell you much more as to what great things happened in our history in Jerusalem. Anyway, be that as it may, at the end of the Ottoman period, with the arrival of the British and the ever continuous problems of rivalries in the Holy Land, and after the British, the Jordanians, and now the Israelis, everybody thanks God for a document called the status quo of sacred sites in Jerusalem. You probably have heard about it. It was issued by the Sultan in 1853, which in effect declares that as of this date, 1853, all Christian communities in Jerusalem are entitled for good to the possessions they own or possess as of now. And nothing is to be changed. And so this becomes a good document to fall on, to resolve situations that still beset us in Jerusalem to this day. It's a wonderful document. And so what we Armenians are entitled to, thanks to the status quo, is ours for good. The challenge is, can we maintain it? Can we keep it for good? Given the plight of Christian communities in the Holy Land, not just Armenians, but the situation is worse among Armenians. Because we don't speak about the present number of the Armenian community in Jerusalem. When asked by our Jewish colleagues or friends, we say just in Jerusalem alone, no less than 2,000. When we know it could well be far below 1,000. When we speak about the present situation, it is indeed lamentable when at the end of the 20th century, the Armenian community dwindled almost to the verge of non-existence. When at the beginning of the 20th century, it was big and viable. And adding to that viability, of course, was the arrival of survivors of the Armenian genocide in 1915. Those survivors of the Armenian genocide being driven south of their homeland in Cilicia, arriving in Aleppo, Syria, and further south, overland, Jerusalem was as far south as they could go. Some settled in Haifa, some in Jaffa, some came as far as Jerusalem. Those who ended up in Egypt most likely came by way of sea to Alexandria and then to Cairo. But think about the survivors of the Armenian genocide who felt strong enough and with thanksgiving for their survival to continue as far as to Jerusalem. And they gave a boost to the Armenian community. Now, as you all know, in 1946, quite many emigrated to Armenia. But throughout the 50s and the 60s, others, my generation, and my good friends from Jerusalem, Berjan, Sebu, Tasha, our generation, there's hardly of us left. When I think about my classmates who graduated with me from St. Archmanchats in Jerusalem, none of those who graduated are in Jerusalem. I know of no one who is still in Jerusalem. The only classmate I know who is still in Jerusalem is the one fellow who did not graduate.
A businessman.
No. Sergey Gadutsa. Anyway, in Jerusalem we have nicknames for him. Be that as it may, you know, it's a lamentable situation when we look at the plight, not just of the Armenian community in Jerusalem, but the plight of Christian communities throughout the Middle East. Now, of course, when we think about the Patriarchate in Jerusalem, we all wish well for Patriarch Torko. Our prayers go for him. At least he's holding the ship. It's not sinking. But let's pray that this ship will never, ever sink. And it needs a good captain at the helm. And of course, we all believe in divine providence. We all believe in St. James. We pray that this Patriarchate will continue for as long as time lasts or until the Lord returns. But what is needed in Jerusalem is a great patriarch of the kinds we had in the 7th century, in the 12th century, middle of the 16th, middle of the 17th century. Even today, as they are pondering, looking for a coadjutor, Atoragits patriarch, to help out Torko Badriak in Jerusalem, it is really difficult to find one. Even to persuade the best of the candidates that are. If you were to ask me who should become Patriarch of Jerusalem, I would say, go find the best Armenian diplomat in the world. Give him a crash course in theology and liturgy and ordain him as priest and elect him as patriarch. Because we need the best diplomat to become Patriarch of Jerusalem. Our survival depends on a well-groomed diplomatic patriarch.